There is a place that is spoken about only in whispers, a dark area that spawns the beginnings of urban legends, a place where anything can happen and usually does. During the light of day, it hides just outside of view, but when the sun goes down, spirits, creatures of the night, roam free, and things do go bump in the night. It is in every state and every country, and there is no escaping it, no matter how safe you feel behind your locked doors and latched windows. So we invite you to turn down the lights and turn up your radio while we join Dave Schrader and Tim Dennis, your hosts, on a journey into the darkness on the edge of town.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us here. I'm Dave Schrader. That's Tim Dennis. We're your hosts this evening. And we've got an interesting show, Tim. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum will join us for the last 2 hours of this evening's show, Demystifying Bigfoot. Now, here's a man who has spent a considerable amount of his life researching anthropology and understanding where we come from in this universe, where our place is in the species, and has still maintained a passion for researching Bigfoot and cryptozoological things. But he comes from a science-backed place. It's not just a guy who has a weekend interest, and I'm not putting those people down, but This guy comes from a real hard-edged scientific approach looking at Bigfoot. And he has a unique perspective. I had a chance about a year ago to sit with him as we were delayed over and over at an airport to just talk Bigfoot. And what I loved was how he straddles the fence. And he can keep both feet pretty firmly grounded in the ideas of Bigfoot and see the issues with the idea of the phenomena of Bigfoot.
Interesting.
So we're going to talk about that tonight. We'll talk about, and I'm going to throw him a lot of the pitches that people come at us with, or come at the Bigfoot field with, saying, Bigfoot can't exist because of this, or because of this, or because of this. And we'll get those perspectives from him. We'll also get his perspectives of why he believes most of what we see as quote-unquote evidence is not, in fact, really evidence. So I think it's going to be an interesting couple of hours this evening. So we'll be doing that in the last 2 hours of tonight's show. First hour, though, Tim, Deborah Diamond is joining us. She has a book, and she is the author of this book called Life After Near Death, Miraculous Stories of Healing and Transformation in the Extraordinary Lives of People with Newfound Powers. It's the only book to look at the near-death experience through its miraculous after effects. So let's welcome for the first time to Darkness Radio, Deborah Diamond. Deborah, thank you for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here.
Talk to me a little bit about your background and who you are and where you came to in your life that this was a focus of your research and understanding.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, let me take the first part, who I am. Professionally, I'm a psychic and I'm a medium, but I wasn't always a psychic. I don't look like a traditional psychic, if there is such a thing, and I don't certainly come from a metaphysical type of background. My professional background was actually in the investment business. I was in the investment business for about 30 years. I was a money manager on Wall Street. So I have a very unusual background for somebody who's a practicing psychic and a medium. This was not something that I actually set out to do. Something happened to me. I had an unusual experience in 2008, what's called, I think, a spiritually transformative experience, an STE. And in this experience, I found that I was able to see people who had passed over. Again, this was not something I was seeking. It was not something that I was looking for.
Could you tell us a little bit about what that experience was that awakened this sense in you?
Sure. Well, when I worked on Wall Street, I found that I knew things. I didn't know how I knew things, but I would know about a company or how an investment might do or about how an industry or what a management team might be like, even before I met them or had done any research. And I never really understood how it was that I was able to know these things. Because, on Wall Street, they don't talk about being psychic. That's just not part of the vocabulary. And although they do say, what does your gut tell you? That's something that does come up. But being psychic is nothing that's ever referenced, of course. So my boss used to say, Deborah, you have really good instincts. And I thought, well, yeah, I guess I just have good instincts. I didn't know what was going on. I just knew I knew things.
Right. So
in 2008, I decided to take an intuition development class in New York because I thought, after all, I have good intuition. It would be fun to take a class to tune it up. So I signed up for this class. It was a weekend class, and I went. And Saturday morning, there were about 25 people in the class, men and women. I didn't know any of them. And Saturday morning, we did a few exercises and psychometry and communicating without any visual cues. And I was getting everything. And I didn't really understand how that was possible. But, oh well, it was fine. It was pretty low-key. And we took a break. And then the teacher said, when we came back from the break, she said, now we're going to do a seance. Well, this was not exactly what I came for. I wasn't, too interested in participating in a seance, but I thought, well, it's a weekend class. It was only Saturday morning. I'll just go ahead and do it. Nothing's going to happen anyway.
Famous last words, right?
Exactly. So she put us in a meditative state and said, I'm going to take you out of the meditative state, and if you see anything, you let me know and I'll tell you what to do. And I thought, well, that's fine because I'm not going to see anything. It doesn't pertain to me. So I meditated, and she took us out of the meditation, and she said, does anyone see anything? And I looked around the room, and everyone was looking at everyone else. And I raised my hand, and she said, yes, Deborah, what do you see? And I said, I see about 50 people. So this, I had this profound breakthrough. And I have to say, it was overwhelming. It was frightening. I had no context for any of this.
Well, right. You had gone into it with the idea that nothing would happen. This wasn't for you. What is the repercussions to you when suddenly you kind of awaken and open your eyes to this reality around you?
Well, it was something that unfolded over a period of time, but in the very near term, what happened was the teacher said, well, for instance, if you see something in the corner of the room, if you see someone in the corner of the room, that probably means they go with someone who's sitting in that corner. So I said, well, I do see someone in the corner, and I described him. He was Hispanic and had dark hair parted in the middle and a handlebar mustache. He kind of looked like Tony Orlando.
Okay.
Remember Tony Orlando?
Sure.
And I started to describe him, and the woman sitting in that corner began to sob. And she said, I know who you're talking about. That was my fiancé. He died 2 years ago. So the woman whose fiancé had passed said to me, during the break, if I show you some pictures on my cell phone, will you be able to identify him? And I said, sure, because he was plain as day to me. So
right.
During the break, she flipped through some pictures on her cell phone, and I said, there, that's him. And she said, yes, that's my fiancé. He died 2 years ago. And she said, I'm so grateful because she had wanted to hear from him. She believed in all this. She wanted to hear from him, but she hadn't. So she was very grateful to me for making this connection. Now, you have to remember, I worked on Wall Street, okay? Nobody thanks you for anything there.
Right.
And she gave me a big hug, and you don't get a lot of hugs either on Wall Street. So, it wasn't lost on me that I had done something profound, that I had done something meaningful for someone. So I was still, pretty overwhelmed and flabbergasted, but I recognized that I had done something important or, meaningful for someone. So the rest of that weekend, I stayed in the class, and then Sunday night, I drove home to Baltimore. I live in Baltimore. And on my way home, I called one of my sons. I have 3 sons, but this particular son scores very high in logic tests. So I called him, and I explained to him what happened in this class. And he didn't say a word when I told him, but when I was all done, he said, well, that makes sense. We're just energy, and the energy has to go somewhere. So that gave me a context, to try to understand this phenomena a little better. I didn't tell anybody what happened because, remember, I came from a Wall Street background. Most people I knew worked on Wall Street. They wouldn't have understood. They would have laughed at me, or even worse, they would have thought I was crazy. So I didn't tell anybody. That summer, I decided to go out to Taos, New Mexico. I don't know if you've ever been to Taos, Dave.
I have not, no.
Oh, it's a wonderful place. It's a mecca for artists and writers and creative people, spiritual people. And I had been out to Taos a number of times in the past, and I thought I'll go out there this summer to paint because I'm also an artist. And I rented a place for a few months, and I went out there. And what happened was, a few years later, I was still there. And that's a very common theme for Taos. If you meet the locals and you say, how long have you been here? They say, oh, I came, for a weekend about 20 years ago. So it's one of these energetic centers that has a hold on people, on a certain kind of person. And that's what happened to me. I stayed there. I began to unpack this gift that had been given to me. It seemed very normal out there to do this work. I began to do readings and teach and go deeper into the metaphysical work.
Sure. So that was kind of your moment of awakening and realizing that not only was this just intuition, but there was more connection to the universe than you ever believed.
Well, I that's right. I always believed that there was more than what we experience or what we see. I always felt that there was something more out there, but nothing like what I encountered. So this is when I relaxed about this gift that was given to me, and I began to work with it.
We need to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll find out more about this gift. We'll find out about the book and the special gifts that many people have. We'll do that next on Darkness Radio. Guest with her book, Life After Near Death, Miraculous Stories of Healing and Transformation in the Extraordinary Lives of People with Newfound Powers. Life After Near Death profiles a dozen cases of near-death experiences after effects, including newfound musical and artistic talents, mathematical gifts, enhanced hearing, elevated IQ, improved vision, and much more. That's an intriguing aspect we have never heard before. So that's what fascinated about about having me bring you on this evening, Deborah. Talk to me about some of these cases and when you started to realize it was more than just these visits down a tunnel of white light and hearing from our loved ones. When did you start to realize that sometimes when we come back with a different kind of awakening?
Sure, Dave. Well, what happened was I eventually came back to the East Coast from Taos, and when I came back, after some time, I was practicing as a psychic and a medium, and I was asked to read for a well-known NDEer. And this individual came back from his NDE with artistic abilities, artistic gifts. And, psychics see things in symbols. And when I was reading for him, I was getting some very unusual symbols that I don't usually see when I'm reading for people. But he did come back with these unusual abilities. And that evening, when I came back from Washington, I started thinking about what happened to him. Why was he given these abilities, and how did he get them? And what about other NDEers? What did they get, if anything? And what were they supposed to do with them? So I Googled near-death experience after effects, and guess what I found out?
What was that?
There was very little research. So I decided, I guess I'll have to do the research. Now, it's not as far-fetched as it sounds, because remember, I said I used to work on Wall Street. I was a healthcare research analyst for many years. And not only that, I worked on companies and industries that were so early stage that they weren't even cutting edge. So I had to do original research. So I knew how to do this kind of research. So that's really what kicked it off. But I was only interested in those cases that were demonstrable and definitive. So in other words, people who had either cognitive abilities, like some of the ones you mentioned, musical ability, mathematical ability. There's a case in the book of a woman who gets quantum physics downloads. And she has absolutely no background in this. She was a former hairdresser. So, there's those types of abilities, and they're irrefutable. And then I was also interested in the physiologic changes, and those are elements such as improved hearing, enhanced vision, higher IQ, electrical sensitivity, spontaneous healing, these sorts of things. And I was interested in these aspects because they could all be proven. Now, there are many people who come back from near-death experiences and say, I'm more spiritual now, or I'm a psychic. Many people come back psychic or mediumistic. And that's fine, but there was no way that I could prove that. If they said I'm more spiritual than I used to be, there's just no test for that. But if they say I'm getting quantum physics downloads, like this particular woman has 32 bins of downloads that she keeps stored in her closet, that's something that you can prove. Or, higher IQ. There's a case in the book of a woman whose IQ was 122 prior to her NDE, and after her NDE, it was 145, and this was all tested. So, it's proven. This is something that nobody talks about in the NDE vernacular. Most of what you hear about NDEs are what you said earlier about the light and the tunnel, the elements of the NDE. That's really what's been discussed and been publicized by the media. But what they don't talk about is what happens when you come back from an NDE, and in particular, people who come back with these abilities. Now, not everybody comes back with these abilities. Not everybody comes back with the same gifts, but many people do.
When you look at these different versions of NDEs where people come back with gifts, have you noticed any traceable correlations to blood transfusions, perhaps even body replacement parts? I can't think of the word. Transplants. Have you noticed that in people that have new skills, new abilities, new memories, that there's that part of the factor that's playing into it, and maybe they're taking on the memories, thoughts, and abilities of the people that they were, getting the transfusions or body parts from?
That's a really interesting thought. In a way, you're sort of venturing into the realm of the cyborg. But in fact, there's a little bit of a misconception, because with NDEs, you do not have to clinically die to have an NDE. I found out very early on that when I was doing this research and I would talk about the cases, people would say, well, how long did that person die for? And in fact, in many cases, NDEs are a result of trauma, drownings, heart attacks, surgery, but not always. You don't have to clinically die to have an NDE. The key is whether you come back transformed. Now, the media and the elements have been so publicized, the elements of the NDE, which include things like the light and the tunnel and a life review, that I found when I was doing research that many of the cases that I spoke to would say to me, I don't know if my NDE was valid because I didn't see any beings of light, or I didn't have a life review. So there are some people who have very rich experiences and have only a few elements, and there are some people who have numerous elements. But again, the key is whether you come back transformed. And when they come back transformed, not only do they have some of these abilities, but the key is that most of them now have 1 foot in the universe and 1 foot on Earth.
See, that's where I come in, Deborah. Is I've had a few near-death experiences, and I have no memory of white lights, of voices, of tunnels, of friends. And unfortunately, I didn't wake up any smarter than I went down. So I feel like I got cheated on my NDEs. But I don't want to put that out to the universe that it's okay to put me there again, because I don't need to be there. But I can understand where there are some people that are frustrated with it. When we come back, why do some people have that experience? Why don't they? We'll ask Deborah Diamond, our guest, next on Darkness Radio. Let's talk. I know that you cover about a dozen different cases in this book, and I'd like to know some of the more extreme cases, if you don't mind sharing that with our listeners.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Each of the cases represents a different type of transformation. So we have people who come back with musical ability and with artistic ability, and enhanced hearing and enhanced vision. So one of the cases is interesting because this guy is a police officer, or he was a police officer, and policemen are in the news a lot. He was, his name is Robert Bear, and he was a policeman in South Central L.A. and in Watts. He was in the riot squad, so he would beat people and gas people. He was not a very nice guy. And he had, in 2010, he had a physical, and everything was fine, and he went off to visit his son in Phoenix. And he had a pleasant week in Phoenix, and his son dropped him back off at the airport to fly back home. And he said he wasn't feeling very well, but as he said, he John Wayne'd it at the airport, and he got on the airplane. And when he got on the airplane, he dropped dead. I mean, this is a case where somebody actually did die. So he dropped dead, and luckily there were some paramedics on the plane, and they revived him. But he did have a fairly intense experience and had an NDE. Now remember, he had a physical before his NDE, and in the physical he also had an eye exam. And his eyesight was 20/90 before his NDE. And afterwards, he had another physical and another eye exam, and his eye exam this time was 20/10, better than perfect vision. And it's 5 years now, and it's still going strong. Now, not only that, but he's a completely different guy. He is no longer a policeman. He says he only wants to do good in his life. He had a rather intense life review in his NDE, where he was able to see and hear what various people he knew were saying about him behind his back, and it was enlightening. And so now he's dedicated to doing good. So now he writes grants for not-for-profits, for unwed mothers. He coaches a softball team in his town. He was given an award as Citizen of the Year in his town in Oregon. He's a totally transformed person. And what you hear from many of these people, like Robert and their families, are that, they say, "We don't recognize you. Who are you?" And they don't recognize themselves. They've been totally transformed.
Right. Now, was this a head trauma? Could there have been any possibility that when he collapsed that, there might have been a bang of the head? Because we know that can actually have an impact and an effect on personality. And in a heart attack or mini stroke, the blood being either saturating a certain area or being depleted from another can cause personality traits and changes in your disposition, your anger, any of that kind of deal.
Right. I think medical trauma, certainly, you have to recognize that can change, that can produce changes in behavior and personality. But across the universe of NDEers, this kind of spiritual transformation where they're more connected with spirit, they're more connected with the universe, seems to be very prevalent. And again, not everyone has trauma, physical trauma, when they experience an NDE. What seems to happen is that people come back with their energy altered. Now, what do I mean by that? We walk around on Earth with a certain percentage of physicality, our physical body, to consciousness. Some people have a lot of consciousness. There are a lot of people who walk around with very little consciousness.
Right.
But NDEers appear to come back with sort of an overload of consciousness. They come back with their energy altered, and it's almost like their consciousness gets thrown out of their physical body, And it's almost like it gets tanked up by the universe or recharged by the universe. And this is one of the reasons why when they come back they have difficulty adjusting to life on Earth because, again, part of them is out in the universe now. There are many types of transformations that take place when they return. From these alterations that are new types of behavior to things like divorce. 65% of NDEers, according to the statistics, get divorced. There are certain sensitivities that may develop, such as chemical sensitivity or sensitivity to light or even to certain foods. And many of them have a difficult time keeping track of time, which makes sense. I mean, if you have one foot out in the universe, you're no longer really grounded to Earth. So these are things that cannot be explained by, some sort of physical trauma, and again, not everybody, has a physical event.
Right. We have to take our final break with Deborah Diamond. We'll come back and hear about some more of the interesting cases that she profiles in her new book. We'll do that next on Darkness Radio. Send your songs to tim@darknessradio.com, tim@darknessradio.com. And if we like them, maybe you'll hear them as a bumper from time to time on Darkness Radio. We're back with our guest, Deborah Diamond, as we talk about her book. We've got just about 10 minutes left together, Deborah, so let's cover a couple more of your favorite cases, some of the experiences from the book that you share.
Well, let me mention, one of the cases, and then I also want to talk about some of the recurring themes that kept cropping up.
Sure.
So first one of the cases. In this particular case, this is a physician who was former chief of cardiac anesthesiology at Bakersfield Heart Hospital in California. And this doctor was a type double or triple A personality. He would get up in the morning and he would drive in either his Hummer or his sports Mercedes to the hospital at 6 in the morning, and he'd be talking to his stockbroker, and if someone would try to cut him off in traffic, he would go after them. He and his wife lived in a 15,000 square foot house. It was so large that they needed cell phones to find the kids. And he and his wife were at home one evening, and they got a call from his doctor, and his doctor said, "I have good news and bad news." Well, all he remembered was the bad news, which was that he had prostate cancer. He ended up having surgery on the cancer, and he actually had multiple surgeries. And in the course of those surgeries, he became addicted to pain pills, and he also began to suffer from depression. By his seventh, they were getting ready for his seventh surgery, and when sepsis set in, and he had to be ambulanced to UCLA Medical Center. While he was on the operating table, he had his NDE. And in his NDE, he saw his mother and his sister drinking tea in India. His family lived in India. And his mother was wearing a red sari, and his sister was wearing a green shirt and blue jeans. 2 days after his NDE, he talked to his mom and told her this, and she said yes. At the moment that he was on the operating table, they were in fact drinking tea, and that's what they were wearing. So, after his NDE and after the surgery, he was cured of stage 4 cancer. He was cured of sepsis, of depression, and addiction. Within 2 weeks, he resigned from his medical practice. He sold his house and moved into a smaller house. He sold his cars and bought a Prius. And he's now dedicated, like Robert Baer, he's dedicated to helping people. Now, I wanted to mention some of the themes that came up in this book because they are linked back to this concept of helping others. One theme that emerged was all the cases asked me, what is my mission? They all had two questions. Why did this happen to me, and what is my mission? And they all used the word mission. They didn't say, what's my life path, or what job should I take? They all said, what's my mission, as if they had been given a mission. And in fact, it appeared as if these NDEers return to act as beacons of light to light our earth. And they all do feel like they have a mission to help others. And now some of them are able to do that. They come back with skills and talents and abilities that, in fact, can be translated to earth, but not all of them do. I mean, some of them come back with with other abilities or really no abilities, some of them, except they know they want to do good. So that concept of mission kept surfacing. And there were a couple of other themes that were recurring. Manifestation and intention may be involved in this experience because some of the individuals outright asked for the experience, and others appeared to almost be in training. Now, what do I mean by in training? Many of them had begun to change their diets, maybe became vegetarians, began to practice yoga, became, more spiritually oriented, and then boom, they had their NDE. So, it was almost like they were getting ready for it. But some of them asked specifically for this experience. They asked for it. So that was a theme that came up. Another theme that came up was that abuse, childhood abuse, that shows up fairly regularly in the experiencers' backgrounds. So, and there are more. There are other themes that come up as well. But, those are the ones that are key. And the takeaway from all of this, again, is that these individuals who return from their NDEs return with their energy altered and they're completely transformed. So, the key is that we are all made up of energy and that energy is forever. The essence that makes us up, is energy, and that energy doesn't die. Our physical body may die, but our essence does not.
Right, but at the beginning of the show, you said that you were only looking for cases that were quantifiable. And saying that their energy changed, we have no way to measure what their energy was beforehand and what their energy is like at this point. So how do we know that there's truly an energetic shift?
Well, it's a good question, and you're absolutely correct that we have no scientific way to measure, this higher form of energy. But what happened when I was researching these cases is I started to, the cases left me little clues, as I was doing the work. For instance, Robert Baer came back with enhanced vision. Well, vision is made up of light waves. Okay, another case is a fellow came back with enhanced hearing. Well, what is hearing? Hearing is sound waves. As I went back and I sort of tracked each of these changes, energy seemed to be involved. Some form of energy seemed to be involved. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I cannot tell you definitively what sort of energy played a role in this. I don't think we know. We don't know. But it seems as if they come back energetically altered. Because, again, these enhanced abilities that they have, many of them seem to be a manifestation of energy.
Do you believe that there could be possibilities that in these cases there is what's known as a transference or a walk-in, that the soul of the person that died truly moved on to their next level, and that another soul has, much like the movie Heaven Can Wait, and I think Waiting for Mr. Jordan was another one that was similar, where the soul of somebody who maybe departed and was still lingering took over the physical form of that person, and they'll have a mixture of both personalities?
I don't think we know that for sure. I mean, anything is possible.
Right, but you're a medium and you talk to the dead. I would think that would be one of the most plausible ways you would reach out and try to touch souls with that person to see if that might be more of a plausible experience or understanding of what occurred.
Yeah, I did read for all these people, and I didn't get anything like that for when I did these readings. I mean, they came back as themselves. They were still themselves, but they came back top heavy with consciousness, and they don't know what to do with it. And this is what creates a lot of this behavior.
Which might make sense that there are two consciousnesses still locked in one physical form and why they're top heavy. Because if we can't prove medically that something has physically changed on them, but we do know that medically, depending on the injury, it can alter the personality depending on the oxygen deprivation to the body or blood soaking or others. There is that scientific angle we can look at that would make complete sense. It's much like the reluctant serial killer out of, I think it's Seattle. He suffered a major head injury and became a serial killer after that because of these strange he couldn't control the passions to kill once that happened, and it was not part of who he was prior to that accident. And if there is two souls in one body or the remnants of a soul in a new one, it would seem that might make sense of why there's this top-heavy consciousness.
Yeah, I am not sure that what happens to these people is that they're coming back. You know, one of the questions that I get a lot is, what about reincarnation? And, you know, the concept of coming back with a walk-in is somewhat related to that. I don't believe, according to the research that I did and the readings that I did with these people, that there was anything like that. Now, you know, in terms of people having head injuries and, you know, coming back as serial killers and whatnot, I mean, what you're talking about there is a concussion syndrome.
Right, and that's a possibility. That's why I said there's so many questions that are raised with this type of scenario. Pick up a book, read it for yourself, judge. The name of the book, again, Life After Near Death, Miraculous Stories of Healing and Transformation in the Extraordinary Lives of People with Newfound Powers. Thank you to our guest, Deborah Diamond. Stay tuned. When we return, Demystifying Bigfoot with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum on Darkness Radio. Welcome to the best in paranormal talk radio. Darkness Radio is on the air. Bigfoot, Tim. There's so much interest in this character. I mean, from the onset of the, I keep wanting to call it the Zapruder film, from the onset of the Patterson-Gimlin film and the popularity surrounding it and all of the TV shows that have shown that framed footage, I've got to guess, you know, I say it jokingly, but I got to guess the Patterson-Gimlin film has been viewed and reviewed as much, if not as the same amount as the Zapruder film for JFK.
Oh, I'd agree, yeah.
There have been people around the world who have broken this video down in every way, shape, and form, and tried to make sense of what it is that we're seeing in here, and trying to separate fact from fiction. Is this, in fact, a hoax? Is this a possibility? Is it a reality? And one of the people we've had an interest to meet with at a few different events throughout the years, and somebody who I really enjoy speaking with just on a one-on-one basis because he always has such a unique perspective to bring to this, is our guest for the next 2 hours. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum is with us. He's a full professor of anatomy and anthropology and a professor of the Department of Anthropology at Idaho State University. Certainly one of the things, when you look up Bigfoot, one of the people that you will find involved in the research, study, and understanding is Dr. Meldrum. I find it fascinating that your name is attached to the Bigfoot research and investigations, Dr. Meldrum, and I think it's great that as somebody involved in science and understanding where we come from and our place in humanity on this planet, I'm glad that it's, you know, that science does take a hard-edged look at this. What drew your attention to the study of Bigfoot?
Well, it was a number of things. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and so I was exposed to some of the stories, and as you mentioned, the Patterson-Gimlin film played a significant role. I was about 11 years old when Roger Patterson came through Spokane, Washington, where I lived at that time, and showed his documentary that showcased that 60 seconds of film, and already being interested in primates and cavemen and everything, you know, prehistoric and mysterious, it made a huge impression at that time. But it was much later, as my professional career sort of took shape, that the interest became had more of a context within the framework of science, and coming face to face with a very distinct and lengthy set of footprints likewise made another kind of impression, I guess you could say, on my mind at that time. And the implications of those remarkably fresh and clear, unmistakable footprints in the mud were quite profound. I remember sitting there thinking, do I really want to go down this road? But how could I not? I mean, my interest professionally was in the evolution of human bipedalism, and all of my research up to that point had focused on the adaptations of the human foot and the evidence of the timing and the pattern of emergence of those characteristics that distinguish us from other primates in that unique way. And so these tracks and all the other footprints that had been accumulating, constitute probably the most prolific body of evidence that makes this more than just a collection of stories. That has a real significant role to play, which unfortunately many of my colleagues, because of the nature of the phenomenon of the question, have refused to engage in an objective and inquisitive way. Although that's changing, I see a lot more behind the scenes than your many in your audience, those whose exposure to Bigfoot in large measure is limited to documentaries and reality TV shows. There's a lot more going on behind the scenes, a lot of conversations, a lot of interest, especially in the upcoming generation. Sometimes it takes a whole turnover of an entire generation before an idea can catch a hold and get some traction, and that's beginning to take place.
There is science that looks at our place and where we come from, and we have it seems to me, a limited understanding. We say that, we evolved from this, we moved to here. Then we hear things like missing links. There's gaps where it doesn't seem to make sense of how evolution jumped from one place to another. And that's what we, as a lot of the lay people, understand. As somebody who actually has an understanding of anthropology, are there truly missing links? Are there really gaps? Or how do we understand that?
Well, certainly. The term missing link, in fact, came from, it's kind of an archaic term, and it sometimes is misleading. Back in the time in pre-evolutionary thought, as biologists were beginning, and many of these were clerics. Often it was the clergy who had the time to pursue, and the patronage, to pursue the study of natural history. And they sought to reveal the order of God's creation, and they saw this as a great, what they call a great chain of being. But it was clear that we didn't, that civilization didn't have a full understanding of that creation, and so there were links that were missing from this great chain of being. Particularly, for example, there must be something to fill that tremendous void that existed, that would seem very obvious, between humans and the rest of nature. And remember, at that time, in Western Europe, or Western Europe, there were, the types of wildlife, the types of animals that your average person encountered or into contact with were barnyard animals, farm animals. And so there seemed to be a tremendous void. Any knowledge of man-like primates was just beginning to be realized, and even in the 18th century. And so those were the missing links. Now, obviously, today we have in science we have an evolutionary perspective, a notion of the origin of species and descent with modification from pre-existing species. And much of what we understand about that comes from the fossil record. And we recognize that the fossil record is very, very spotty. Now, this is something that in human evolution has really just taken a little bit of a different turn, just in the course of my career. When I was a graduate student, there was a notion called the single species hypothesis that was just kind of starting to crumble. The foundation upon which that rested, as in terms of human evolution, was beginning to succumb to new ideas. But the notion was simply, anthropologists had borrowed a principle from ecology called the competitive exclusion principle. That was simply noting that no two species could occupy a single niche. One would do it better than another, and drive the other to extinction. This had been demonstrated with microorganisms. Gauss had used paramecium and shown, you could grow 2 colonies of paramecium in the same medium. They were happy campers there, and they grew quite well. But you put them together in that same medium, and very rapidly one of the species would become extinct. The other would prevail. So anthropologists thought, well, okay, the hominid niche is so unique, so particular, that there could be only one. And so the evolution of humanity from our ancestry was seen as kind of a single line, with one species being succeeded by another, and then subsequently by another. This single species hypothesis. Well, the ink was just barely dry on the papers that were promoting that notion when it was discovered that there were multiple species coexisting in East Africa. Richard Leakey showed that there were Homo erectus and Homo habilis, and even robust Australopithecines living side by side. And now we know that in many sites there are, as many as 6 or 8 species of hominid. With each passing year, new discoveries keep adding additional species to this bush instead of a single tree trunk. And so there were many species contemporaneous. And then the flip side to that coin is that we've also been discovering many species that have persisted until much more recently than had ever been appreciated. There was just a jaw found off the coast of Taiwan just last year that was dredged up by a fisherman, and it's a Homo erectus. Homo erectus, or maybe Homo heidelbergensis, the species that immediately preceded us, Homo sapiens. But it was dated and was found to be less than 10,000 years old. Well, that's half as old as the youngest date that has been given for Homo erectus previously. There's a species of a specimen of Homo heidelbergensis found north of Beijing that dates between 10 and 20,000 years. There's a recently described Neanderthal site that was less than 10,000 years. So, you only have to go back 10 or 15, 20,000 years into Asia, and you might encounter any one of a half a dozen different species that were living side by side with humans. So why would the present be any different than the past? I mean, why do we assume, in the face of so much evidence to the contrary, that we are the only ones, the only hominins now surviving? And there have been many books written with that very title. There's one by Chris Stringer, a paleoanthropologist at the British Museum of Natural History, called Lone Survivors. And it's looking at this notion, and that has been the prevailing idea. Now, one event that kind of turned that on its ear, and I thought would have had much more impact, but it seems to, it takes a lot more impact than just that. But the discovery of Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, the little tiny diminutive hominin that was discovered there in Indonesia, and was dated to only between 13 and 18,000 years old, the youngest skeleton. And even Chris Stringer is quoted as saying, when I first heard the stories of the discovery of Homo floresiensis, I immediately thought of the possible parallels to the orang pendek. Now, the orang pendek is the Malaysian term for a little 3-foot-tall, hair-covered hominin that presumably are scattered throughout the forests of Southeast Asia. Probably the same thing as what was found on Flores, the little hobbit. And so here was something, and then the discoverers were even kind of coyly acknowledging that, well, actually, the natives have been telling us stories about these little hairy people that live up in the mountains. And, in fact, some early European colonists here to Indonesia also reported encounters with such creatures, but they'd been dismissed as, misidentifications or just, simple folklore. Now, maybe the possibility of a relic Australopithecine, which is the most likely candidate, either Australopithecine or early Homo habilis, living up until just, the present, or at the very least, demonstrably, 10 to 20,000 years ago, is a very real possibility. So the Henry Gee, the managing editor of Nature, one of the premier scientific journals in the world, in an editorial, noted that, with the discovery of this, maybe there's a kernel of truth to the stories of the Yeti or even the Sasquatch.
Well, let's take that. We have to go to a break. When we come back, let's start to discuss the positives for there being a species that may still exist on Earth that we haven't fully explored or been able to scientifically prove, and look at the theories against. We'll do that with our guest, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, next on Darkness Radio. Here's something that, a lot of people will throw out there when they're making the case for Bigfoot not existing. And you just talked about the fact that we're finding more and more of these subsections of humans that have dwelled on the earth and these legends that seem to be living up to what we're finding now. The big case for there being no Bigfoot is, why have we not stumbled on a body? Why have we not stumbled on a carcass somewhere of one of these creatures? And that's a pretty plausible, or not plausible, but I think that's a pretty effective question. How do you explain why there's nothing, there's no bones, there's no skulls or hands or feet or anything to back up these claims in 2016? After all these years, we've never dug them up by accident.
Right. Well, as far as digging them up, as far as fossilization, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. These what we understand as the likely habitat for these creatures is wet forests. That seems to be, critical ingredient is, they're usually seen very close to water. So, keep two things in mind. Let's talk about the ecology, the habitat in which they live in, and the natural history of the creature. If these creatures indeed exist, they must be extremely rare, and that would make sense for a large-bodied primate. One that has a slow, if we can extrapolate reasonably from other existing great apes, they have a long lifespan, they have a slow development, slow reproductive rate. It doesn't take a lot of them to maintain a population. And so, you've got to think in terms, always remind yourself we're talking about an extremely rare animal. We have little bits and pieces of inferential evidence, like that would suggest something like a home range maybe of 1,000 square miles. And in 1,000 square miles, you might have a male that, say, they tend to be solitary, and that's based on the fact that most encounters are with single individuals, and most footprint finds are of single individuals, or a female, presumably female, with an offspring, a younger one, in tow. Some really interesting examples of little footprints in the company of a 14, 15-inch foot. I have in my collection here, I've got footprints down to about 3.5, 4 inches in length that have been documented in the field. And so, if you went through a little exercise, say you combine those two types of factors, and you looked at the state of Idaho. I've got a map here on the wall here I'm looking at right now, and if I looked at that and I first just considered the areas that have 16 to 18 inches of precipitation a year or more, enough to support some good wet forests, and then I imagine subdividing that up into 1,000 square mile plots, I would come up with, depending on the topography and the forest cover and so forth, about 10, 12 of those, reasonably, in that are isolated enough from human traffic and so forth, human settlements and whatnot. And so, if you imagine there's maybe in each of those plots there's a male and maybe a couple of females that share that territory, maybe an offspring or two. So 4 or 5. Let's just say 5 for easier math. 5 times 12. There may be only 60 Sasquatch in all of the state of Idaho, and yet we know that there's probably 20 to 30,000 black bear. Now, if you ask hunters or outdoorsmen, how often have they ever found a black bear carcass, a skull out hiking about or walking about that died a natural death, that wasn't shot by a hunter, or hit by a car on the side of the road and was left on the side of the road. And, Dr. Krantz, my predecessor, used to do that every opportunity. I usually don't do it as religiously, just occasionally ask that question of my audiences, but he used to do it quite religiously. And in all the years he was asking that, not once did he have someone, excuse me, who had found a bear remain like that. So if that's the case for bears, then why would we expect to stumble on a carcass? If you've got 70 in the entire state, 60 or 70 in the entire state of Idaho, of those 70, how many of those 70 are in their golden years, are close to death? Because these animals would have no natural predators. They're going to die a natural death or an accident or disease. There's potential as well. But
well, that's assuming that there are no natural predators. Lions, bears, poisonous snakes, I would guess a bite from a poisonous snake would have the same effect on a Sasquatch as it would on a bear or other animals, right?
Well, sure. No, that's true.
So you're going to have those opportunities, and if they're walking around barefoot in those areas, there's probably a higher risk and potential for them to be bitten, especially living in cave environments and walking through the wilderness. So you would automatically assume that might be the case.
Well, that's true. Those are variables that would have to be taken into account as well. But still, the rarity is one of the factors. And then the other thing to bear in mind is that when an animal dies of whatever cause, then it's very quickly rendered down by the scavengers and decomposers and so forth. And what skeletal remains are exposed, aren't chewed up by the pack rats and porcupines and rodents. If they're exposed to the elements of a wet coniferous forest, particularly ones here in the Pacific Northwest that are also associated with volcanic soils, those factors lead to a very acidic environment where bones just do not survive very long if they're exposed to those elements. A case in point is if you look at Gigantopithecus. Here's this giant ape, probably fairly rare as well, given its size and all. But yet we know from what scant fossils we have, and that consists for the biggest species, Gigantopithecus blacki, a species that had a duration of probably 1.5 million years. We have 2 jaws and about 1,000 isolated teeth. And the only reason we have those fossils is because porcupines carried the bones into caves, into limestone caves, and where they gnawed upon them down to leaving the very thick enameled crowns and the thickest parts of a few jaws, where they would be fossilized and later found by people harvesting the minerals there for fertilizer and whatnot. So, there's a species, a giant ape, that we recognize as having existed based on the fossils that exist, and yet all we have to show for 1.5 million years of that species existing are just a handful of bones that we only have because of those 2 factors, limestone caves and the action of porcupines, the collecting and assemblage by porcupines.
We have to take a break. We'll come back and continue on this vein and thoughts. But what about the case for Native American tribes, referring to these creatures that is spread out throughout the entire United States, not just in the wet forestry areas? We find fossilized remains of Native Americans. We find fossilized remains of cavemen. Why would we not eventually find or stumble upon the carcasses, or I'm sorry, not carcasses, but the fossilized remains of Bigfoot in these drier areas, which would be more conducive? We'll talk about that possibility and so much more. Stay tuned. This is Darkness Radio, as we try to demystify the legend of Bigfoot and look at the different stories and the case for and against this giant creature. Like I had mentioned before the break, there's many different Native American cultures around the United States that have talked about this, as some will refer to the wild man or the hairy man species. And in some cases, they say that they exist and they just stay away from them. But those seem to coincide with other versions of Native American culture throughout the United States, not just in the wet, moist, foresty regions, but in the dry, arid regions as well. What do you make of claims from the Native American tribes that seem to have seen this, but yet we find no burial grounds, no burial mounds, no bones, nothing.
Right. Well, one of the things, let me just qualify this conversation again. I don't mean to sound authoritative or too assertive in what I'm saying, because we are just drawing inferences and trying to place it within a reasonable context. Many Native Americans have been quite mobile and have moved from place to place, and so traditions and knowledge or accounts that they have may not pertain to things that they are experiencing in the present. And then there is a difference in quality to the types of stories that different Native American groups have, depending upon the region of the continent that they're living in. Kathy Strain is an anthropologist, archaeologist with the U.S. Forest Service, who's written a fantastic book summarizing many of these accounts, and has kind of made that sort of distinction. But and so that's one aspect, and of course, people obviously are capable of surviving in areas that much more diverse types of areas than some species might be able to. I'm sure these animals are very generalized, and it is, I think, misleading when, as you see on some TV documentaries and so forth, you see it stated that they are encountered in every single state in the Union, and that, I think, that needs to be qualified, that statement. There may be reports from every state in the Union, but I've not seen good evidence in the forums, corroborative evidence, that is, to claims of Bigfoot encounters from every state in the Union. The most credible claims seem to emanate from places where there is an ecological basis for such a creature to exist. They're remarkably coincident with the distribution of black bear. So remarkably coincident that, in fact, that some skeptics have simply pointed out, well, there's your answer. They're just misidentifications of black bear encounters. And I'm sure that there are those types of misidentifications that do take place. I mean, people get enthusiastic. They see what they expect to see, and a flash of dark fur in the foliage may be interpreted as Sasquatch, unjustifiably. But so that, if you look at the distribution of black bear across North America, they are, of course, in the Pacific Northwest and the Intermountain West, and they are across the Great Lakes area and down through the Appalachia into the deep south, and kind of button hook back up into the Four Corners area. And black bears, as large omnivores, are pretty versatile and generalized in their diets sufficiently that they can exploit some more marginal habitats. I think Sasquatch are the same way, and while as I pointed out, wet forests are probably their prime habitat, they may not be the exclusive ones.
So, do you believe, Dr. Meldrum, that a species does coexist with us, that there truly is a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Yeti, whatever you want to refer to them as, that they do currently exist?
I'm convinced of that, yes. I kind of shy from the term belief, because it's such a loaded term in this field. The skeptics, the ideological skeptics, use that label, true believer, as a derogatory moniker, and belief in many people's minds connotes a position of faith, that is, the acceptance of something in the absence of evidence, or at least in the absence of conclusive proof. And while I'm not advocating that anyone accept the existence, I'm simply presenting the evidence. But that evidence has convinced me that, yes, there are these things. And I think not just the Sasquatch, but as we pointed out, we started off talking about the orang pendek, and as it's known by many other names, the Ndutu, the Ibugogo, and so forth. There's the Yeti you mentioned, which sometimes is used in a very generic sense, but but traditionally or originally referred to a form in the Himalayan region, which seems to be more ape-like even than the Sasquatch or the orang pendek. And then you've got the stories of the Almas in Russia, which some have suggested might represent relic Neanderthals. Or now we can add to that group of closely related species the Denisovans and perhaps even other types of pre-sapiens hominin, like Homo heidelbergensis. There's a form up in far eastern Siberia, which, as a youngster when I first read those accounts, I kind of just dismissed that. There must be some sort of native. They're described as often wearing coats of skins and having spears, but extremely primitive. I mean, literally Paleolithic in their behaviors. And maybe those are heidelbergensis, Homo heidelbergensis, for all we know.
All right, we do need to take another break. We'll come back. We've got more with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum right after this. There were so many people that were settling this country and taking notes in diaries of everything that they encountered, from flora to fauna to, hairy beast and so on. Have we found any solid historical reference to Bigfoot population or Bigfoot encounters that aren't just perhaps blown out myth and misunderstandings?
Sure. Well, one of the stories that's often pointed to is the narrative of David Thompson, that was a famous explorer of the Canadian West, and he notes encountering some very large, what appeared to be bipedal footprints that he couldn't account for. Here's someone who's probably very experienced with the sign of large bears, and yet this was odd enough that he thought it worthwhile or justified making particular note of it in his narrative. So yeah, there've been people who have had encounters. Teddy Roosevelt, these are the classic stories that I'm sure many have heard, that recounts a story that was shared with him that occurred here in my neck of the woods, up in the Bitterroot Mountains on the boundary between Idaho and Montana. The story of a unfortunate encounter between a couple of trappers and what seemed to fit the description of a Sasquatch from their recounting, or his recounting. The only one survived, apparently. The second one was dispatched, as the story goes. So there are those sorts of historical encounters, and of course there's there are actually some.
Now, is that with the Teddy Roosevelt? Was that a first-hand account, or was that him retelling something that he had heard from friends?
That was a retelling of a grizzled old trapper, as he described him, related his experience to Teddy, and Teddy was impressed enough to include it in his volume called The Wilderness Trapper. It's interesting now with the ability to search old newspapers that have been digitized and so forth. There are a number of books. One's by a fellow named Scott McLean, where he has just brought together lots and lots of newspaper accounts that span from the eastern states through the areas that we talked about earlier. Of course, they didn't have the word Sasquatch back then, or Bigfoot, but stories about wild men, particularly, or gorillas, things like that encountered in the woods. So, yeah, there is a historical record. And then, of course, you alluded to the Native American traditions, that they go back to their earliest recollections, and these figures play a prominent role in their worldview, in their traditional knowledge. In fact, the wild man figure, I'm working on a second book here, and I was here in the office today looking up some references to the medieval European traditions of wild men. And these things are universal. No, I shouldn't say that. These things are widespread. I always hesitate to use something as broad as universal, because they're not.
Right.
If they were universal, then you could easily sort of dismiss them as just some archetype of the human psyche that we just every culture has its expression of a wild man, and that's not the case. There still seems to be a geographic, an ecological correlation. These stories are most entrenched, most established in areas where now today we have a biological basis or an ecological basis for the existence of such a creature. We don't have them out in the middle of the Sahara Desert. There Bedouins out there don't see hairy wildmen running around. But a fascinating illustration of that principle struck me when I was thumbing through a magazine article one time on an airplane and coming back from a trip, and there was an article about the imperiled status of the Asian tiger. And what struck me was the graphic they had, the map, showing the former and the present distribution of the tiger across Asia. At one time they spanned from the Caucasus all the way, to Siberia and throughout Southeast Asia. And they showed that distribution as of 1900. Then highlighted upon that, they had the fragmented refugia that now exist within as of 1990. And what struck me was, prior to this, I had been collecting examples of footprints attributed to Sasquatch-like creatures, described as being 6 to 8 feet tall, covered with hair, leaving large humanoid footprints with a non-divergent big toe, et cetera, et cetera. And as I looked at this map, the examples that I have found from China, from Indonesia, from India, from the Caucasus, from the mountains flanking the Gobi Desert, the Altai, Tian Shan, and those up through there, every one of these coincided with one exception, coincided with the distributions of tigers. Now, it's not that there's a magical relationship between tigers and giant humanoid or hominoids, but rather, again, it comes back to that ecological factor that the wet forests that tigers prefer and where their remaining range now persists is also the type of habitat that apparently supports the existence of
right. We've got about a minute and a half left in this segment. Ralph Molesworth says, Dr. Meldrum, what's the chance that they were once much more common and that what we are now witnessing is just a creature on the verge of extinction?
Well, that's very possible, and even the Native American stories talk about that. I'm going down to New Mexico, to the University of New Mexico, to give a talk in a couple of weeks, and down there, the natives say that these ancient ones were once much more widespread. This race of giant hairy people, they refer to them, but now they're no longer. And
But as you pointed out, they're really kind of more of the apex predator. They're more of the top of the food chain here. If there's nobody really hunting them, there's nobody really wiping them out. Where is this species going?
Well, it's probably there is still encroachment, just as we saw with the tiger. I mean, it's same. You could say the same thing for that tiger. That tiger's an apex predator, and yet habitat degradation and population expansion, I'm sure, is having some impact.
Right, but tigers are also heavily hunted for their pelts and for different medicinal purposes, right? I mean, there's been all these beliefs behind that.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. There is that pressure that we can't attribute to these. But I mean, I think the biggest impact in this case was, as demonstrated by this map graphic, was the loss of habitat.
All right, we have to take our top of the hour break. We have Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum with us for the next hour. If you have some questions, you can feel free to call in 651-989-5855, 651-989-5855. We know where our guest stands on the belief that this does exist, but I'll ask him when we return to look at the other scope and what are the points that make him question the existence of these beings. We'll do that and so much more on the best in Paranormal Talk Radio. This is back to the show this evening. Our guest, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. Tonight we're making the case for Bigfoot. Could this giant hominid, bipedal creature truly exist alongside us in this day and age? With all the technology and encroachment, could there still be a species that we have not identified? Dr. Meldrum, I know we talked a little bit in the first hour about your belief that, yes, you believe it does exist and that this does happen to be there. What do you think are some of the best points on the other side of how this couldn't possibly be something that is still part of our world?
Well, obviously the common lines of objection have some merit when taken in the proper perspective, but I mean they all need to be kept in perspective, and that's the thing I think where we lose. But we just finished this discussion about where are the bones in the body, and it's frustrating that we have been unable to get DNA from tissues, and we've had some disappointing and downright misleading investigations undertaken that have produced disappointing results. I think inconclusive results. It's funny.
Well, let's talk about that. Dr. Melba Ketchum has taken quite a bit of heat over the last few years regarding a DNA testing that was done on what was believed to be a part of a Bigfoot that was brought back. And I believe we had those two guys on our show talking about their supposed moment of shooting a Bigfoot and going back to find the parts. Why don't you, for recap, kind of tell us a little bit about that story and where the evidence supposedly came from and what the overall outcome was?
Right. Well, Dr. Ketchum, who is a veterinarian, she has a company, several companies. One of her companies, the one that she made me aware of when we first met, was a genetics company, a pedigree, basically, service that primarily to establish pedigrees for show dogs and racehorses. But she got interested, it seemed, so it appeared, in this subject out of intellectual curiosity, and she thought she offered her services. She received numerous, I think it was on the order of like 100, 112 or something, some number of samples, all of which produced, she claimed, DNA results. But she focused on 3 samples where she did whole genomic DNA, where she had sampled large numbers of fragments from the DNA recovered from those samples. And one of those, which figured centrally in her study, was from this kill site of Justin Schmea in the Sierras of California. And I had some first-hand involvement with that incident, not the initial claim, but a colleague of mine became quite intrigued with Justin's story, and his enthusiasm was contagious, and he convinced me to, invited me, I should say, didn't take any convincing, given his enthusiasm. He invited me to come and the following spring. So the story went, Justin, they were out actually poaching bear, as I understand it, and they encountered what he claimed was an adult Sasquatch and shot it against in spite of the protests of his companion, who was afraid that maybe they were shooting a monster movie on this, in the area on location. And
right, which I think is important for people to realize. It sounds kind of dismissive as we giggle a little bit about it, but the fact is, when we had him on the show, he admitted that he saw it, scoped it, and in the matter of seconds took a shot at it, even though his friend was protesting and saying, we don't know if that's not a human dressed in something.
Right.
There was no hesitation for Schmea to shoot and try to kill something he didn't know what it was. And I think that's really
he's illegally poaching.
Right, right.
And so, I got the account straight from the horse's mouth when I arrived on the scene. They, the first thing that Justin did was walk us through the whole scenario on site, and so I could watch the way he told his story, how it related to the surroundings, etc. And there were I was not impressed with it from the get-go, and he could sense that, I'm sure, because he was quite defensive in regarding me and my attitude towards it. But the account was just odd. the thing, I had been given the impression that we were going up there to look for the remains of after the winter had transpired. We looked for the remains of the adult one. That he had actually seen it and then was frightened by its human appearance and had abandoned it, and that we were going to back and see if we could recover any of the remains. Well, it turns out that wasn't the case. Even though he claims he shot it, they never claimed to have examined or to have found the body of the adult. But then they were accosted by these two small ones, and his description of them was very odd. They were about 3 feet tall. He said they had a head the size of a 5-gallon bucket, in his words, that looked like a cross between a black person and a gorilla. And they were jumping around, these two, presumably twins or close in age, and they were running in and out of the brush. And then finally at one point, and during all this, apparently he had separated from his partner who was unarmed. They're out there looking for an 800-pound giant hairy ape that is wounded, presumably, and his partner goes off on his own without a firearm. I mean, that alone should raise a red flag in the credibility of the story.
And according to Smea's report when he was on our show, his friend again said, "Do not shoot these things.
Yeah,
just hold tight. I'll be right back." And exactly. The minute his friend left and one popped its head up, he shot it.
Exactly. Yeah. So he claims.
Right.
So he claims. And so so we were looking. So we scoured. In fact, we had.
Well, and just so we clarify too, when he said he shot another adult-sized one, and then felt bad, and then took a shot at the kid. It rolled down to his feet, and then guilt overtook him, and that's when they decided to bury it. So he missed the first one he killed. He refused to bring back. The second one he killed, he refused to bring back, then felt guilty and thought he should really prove that these exist. So he killed the minor and then decided not to share that one either and buried all of these characters. So
and he actually didn't bury. What he did is they and it wasn't because of the guilty feelings. They had seen a Forest Service vehicle earlier, and so they were afraid that they might be stumbled upon by this ranger out patrolling. And so he pitched it. He pitched it into the alders because he showed us where he threw it. And we scoured. Like I said, we were down on our hands and knees, crawling underneath these alders and all through, and literally in the creek bottom there, looking for any bones, any remains, just to cover our bases. I had arranged and had on site a dog handler, a search and recovery dog handler. With her dogs, you can't. All she was going to do, she agreed to. She was quite intrigued by this whole prospect, but she said, "All I can do is let the dogs out, and while they're not on task and they're looking around, I can watch their body language. If they stumble across something that's unusual to them, that's unfamiliar, they'll react, and I'll know that. But she can't. She can only put them to task on something that they have been trained for. But when I got up there. They were not supposed to have been on site until I arrived, but instead they were already there, including Bobo with his pet dog Monkey, who was running all over hill and dale. And so the dog handler, when she saw the situation, she didn't even let her dogs out, even though the area was completely contaminated. So we didn't have an opportunity to try that. But in any case, I thought it would have been for naught, I'm quite sure, because as this progressed, the search was obviously futile, and we were kind of discouraged. And there was bear sign all over the place. There were tracks galore. In fact, I brought lots of plaster in case we did find any sign, and I took advantage and brought home some great examples for my comparative collection of bear tracks. But in any case, at this point, we're back reconvened in camp, and to try to recover a little bit, Justin reaches in his pocket and pulls out a Ziploc bag, and he had a little postage stamp-sized piece of hide. And they make very clear, in the chit-chat about this, it's been referred to as the steak. I saw photos of what he dug up from the snow, and there was no meat on it, so nothing that could be referred to as a steak. It was a piece of hide with hair attached, skin with hair attached. Fur, to be specific, not hair, but fur. And he had cut a little square of this and salted it so he could carry it around and show it to people. And he hands this to me, and I always carry a little loop, a little geologist loop. I had a 15-power loop, and it's not quite a microscope, but I could get a good close look at this, and I immediately just looked up and looked straight in his face, and I said, I could see guard hairs and underfur. It was not primate hair. And I said to him, this is not primate hair. And he immediately started backpedaling. So, I never said this was Bigfoot. I said, I just said this is what I dug up here when the dog, his bear dog, bear hunting dog, had acted excited about. And so, and this was a very important point, because then subsequently 2 people had it independently tested, and both university laboratories determined it was bear. Now, this was a problem because this sample, when Melba got her hands on it, she was reportedly doing back handsprings, in her words, because this was produced such good DNA, and it was absolutely consistent with all the other samples. Now, she had received, lots of hair samples. She received a nail, a toenail, I think it was. There was a fragment of bone. And supposedly all of these were producing DNA. And I thought, well, how is this? I've looked at lots of hair, and I've had hair tested. People have sent me samples. In fact, when Dr. Sykes was getting samples, I offered to screen some samples for him. I didn't want him to waste his time and money, on just whatever, because people go out and pick up hair, not realizing that hair is extremely durable and persists out there in the environment for a long, long, long time. So even if you have a legitimate encounter, just because you walk over to that tree it was standing behind and find a piece of hair doesn't mean that it came from what you saw. It could have been there for years. But in any case, when I got samples sent to me, 4 out of 5 of them could immediately be eliminated because they could be identified as from common forms of wildlife, just misidentified. They're guard hairs, they're, of a canid, of deer or elk or whatever. And so how is it that every single sample that Melba got produced Sasquatch DNA? And even the sample of bear hair and hide that she got produced Sasquatch DNA. So, honestly, as far as I'm concerned, there just is no credibility to any of the claims that Melba Dr. Ketchum has made. I have yet to see anything. I mean, we could talk all night about the whole chain of events, the claim that it was reviewed, and the paper, the manuscript, that it, the purchasing of a journal and renaming it and self-publishing your paper. I mean, just the whole procedure is the least scientific. There have been a number of
and have you read her papers and research on this?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the funny things, this is one of the things that just made me laugh, was she published a dendrogram, a graph, a branching tree that showed various samples, and lo and behold, the unknown falls right next to a Galago crassicadensis, I think is what the species was, but that's a prosimian, a bush baby. And she made, and then I saw where she talked on a during an interview, she made the comment that yes, they were surprised at the proximity of this sample to the affinity of the sample to this prosimian. But then she said we discovered that at one time there was a 450-pound lemur on the island of Madagascar. Well, what in the world does that mean? So, her scenario is that she's got this hybrid that was spawned by a cross between a pre-sapiens hominin of some kind and a Homo sapiens female dating back to about 15,000 years is her scenario. Now, all of a sudden, it could be a European female, pre-European, I guess, but from the European continent, female crossing with a 450-pound giant lemur from Madagascar. I mean, how did this coupling take place and produce an entire species of a sustained species? I mean, it's just, it borders on ludicrous. It's just, how can you take anything else?
And I think it's important for people to realize, too, Dr. Meldrum wants proof. He wants to believe that Bigfoot exists. He wants there to be definitive proof so that his research and life's work is recognized as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's
I would be her biggest fan club if and this was always funny because of course then if there's any criticism I'm derided as being jealous. See, I feel like I've been scooped, like she's taken the limelight away from me. And that's the farthest thing. Anyone, if you just stop and think about it, just as you said, I would, my 20 years of effort would be justified. And I'd be in a much better position to continue doing the kind of field research. I mean, once we recognize that such a creature exists, the work really starts because we still have to study and find, it's not going to become suddenly any easier. There isn't going to be a Jane Goodall moment where you can go and sit on a hillside. Not that, I don't mean to diminish the accomplishment that Jane Goodall did, but her subjects were social, were gregarious, were loud, were confined to one small little reserve by comparison to the vastness of the Pacific Northwest, the western United States and Canada. That's not going to, we're not going to have a situation like that. There isn't going to be a Jane Goodall or a Diane Fossey who goes out and communes with these solitary, far-ranging creatures, largely nocturnal in their behaviors, it seems, or potentially largely nocturnal. And so it's going to take, we're going to have to take the study to the next step. We're going to have to begin employing technologies like airships, drones, UAVs that can get up there and survey large areas until such time either that or discover something that's just an irresistible attractant that brings them in, so that we can tag them and then follow them, track them and see what their behaviors are and their social structure and all these other things that are necessary to understand their ecology and behaviors.
No real evidence in a DNA or hair fibers, scat, bone, nothing that we can, without a shadow of a doubt, say proves that Bigfoot exists.
Well, no. If you qualify it with that criteria, no. But we do have hair, for example. Dr. Henner Fehrenbach kind of led the charge. He's now retired, and I've tried to kind of pick up, at least on the basis of the hair morphology. I've done molecular sequencing in the past in primate studies, but not to the extent that I'm up on all the latest techniques and generating sequence is one aspect. Interpreting the sequence is a whole other thing, and that's been one of the large criticisms of Melba's project as well, is she's not interpreted what data she has garnered, if indeed she has, and I believe that there have been some legitimate sequences, but they just are not anything pointing to a hybrid species that she has interpreted it as. But we have hair samples that defy attribution to any other known form of wildlife that are essentially primate. The only other possibility is that they're misidentified hair, but we've been unable to get DNA from these because one of the characteristics that distinguishes these from most human hair is the lack of a cellular medulla. Now, in some individuals, that occurs as well. It's not a mysterious, occurrence. It's just that it's in the lack of a cellular medulla, that central core. All you have then is the keratin shaft, this extracellular matrix of protein that doesn't have a lot of DNA. It doesn't have nuclei and mitochondria that harbor the DNA. And so most hair samples that don't have an active follicle, the active root, there isn't a whole lot of DNA in there, and it's really a challenge to get any DNA material. So far, we have not been successful in getting DNA. See, that was another red flag, is Melba claimed that she had a hair specialist. She never would identify him, and there never was a paper, the promised paper that was describing the hair. But she claimed that the hair that she had Sasquatch DNA from had a very obvious medulla, and that doesn't seem to be the case. None of the samples that I've seen that weren't easily attributed to other wildlife had a cellular medulla. So we do have some physical evidence, but it's not, as you say, it's not conclusive proof. In this day and age, you've got to have DNA. There just isn't the hair sample. The hair alone is not sufficient. But we've got the footprints. That's my forte, and that's the most persuasive, for me personally, in part, or to a large measure, because that's what I'm most familiar with.
Well, let's cover that when we return. I want to dig into that, because we've heard of the footprints. We've heard of people collecting footprints for years. And then was the advent of the dermal ridge, which seemed to be setting it apart from possible fake Bigfoot tracks. It may have been boards tied to the bottom of regular shoes that were in the shape of large human feet. What is the dermal ridge? Is this truly a phenomena that is attributed to creatures, that we could prove that this is in fact some form of beast and not just again a faked piece of evidence? We'll talk with our guest about that when we return. Right now, though, I've got some passes because I love these people, Tim. I love them to a fault, almost.
Really?
I've got passes to Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, coming to Showplace Icon at the West End here in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. Special screening on February 2nd at 7:30 p.m. I've got those passes now available. You can call in and get a pair of passes by doing this. Call Tim at 651-989-5855. 651-989-5855. You need a working email address that is non-negotiable. Has to be a working email address, because we will be sending you a link to download those passes. So you have to have a working email address, your phone number, and your name. Tim will take that information, and directly after the show tonight, I will send you the link to the movie so that you can check it out for yourself. A zombie outbreak is fallen upon the land in this reimagining of Jane Austen's classic tale of the tangled relationships between lovers from different social classes in 19th century England. Only this time it's a little different, Tim. This time there are zombies. Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies opens nationwide on the 5th of February. We'll take the first 6 callers right now at 651-989-5855, 651-989-5855. Give the information Tim needs, and I'll email those passes to you. I will also take the very first 5 emails at dave@darknessradio.com, dave@darknessradio.com, and I'll send those links out to you as well. Stay tuned. We've got more with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum and researching, investigating, and the case for Bigfoot next on Darkness Radio. We'll be talking about making the case for Bigfoot. We've talked about some of the flaws, the fly in the ointment, if you will. No DNA, no real proof. But one of the things that's been prevalent through all of these investigations are the footprints. So many different footprints, so many different locations. And let's talk about footprints and the dermal ridge, Dr. Meldrum. What is a dermal ridge, and does that actually play a part in differentiating between a fake footprint and a real footprint?
Only a very small part.
Okay.
And that is because the preservation of dermal ridges is very rare. I have 250-plus casts now in my laboratory collection, and of those, there's only about half a dozen that show discernible ridge detail, and that's simply because the conditions have to be very particular in order to transfer the ridge pattern from the foot to the substrate. That means the substrate has to be of fine enough particulate matter and the right consistency, and then it has to survive until discovered. And these can be very transient. Gravity and wind and weather will flatten those out and obliterate those fine details very quickly, in a matter of hours, actually, if the weather is not cooperative. And then the person preserving the footprint has to, be careful enough to either consolidate that track, particularly if it's in fine dust, for example, or make sure that the mix is just the right consistency that it will pick up and not obliterate that fine detail and transfer it to the plaster cast. So there aren't very many, and the significance, while the significance is high for those individual cases, and Dr. Krantz drew attention to these a long time ago, but it sort of fell on deaf ears. It just did not, again, the old adage, justifiable or not, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidences. And so the notion that even though you've got this evidence that is extremely persuasive to latent fingerprint examiners, for example, in forensic units, the anthropological community was not ready to receive it because of the implication of what it would mean if they did acknowledge it as legitimate. I mean, that would mean that there really was something out there which they could not accommodate, and so.
But why is that such a bad thing? I mean, if I understand this correctly too, and I'm sure you'll correct me quickly, the great apes were kind of a myth, not even 120 years ago.
Oh, exactly.
And that was kind of, there's no way that these things could exist, but they did, and there's proof of it, and it's only been about 120 years, I think it is.
Exactly, and if you look at the narratives of the history of the discovery and unfolding of an understanding of the gorilla, for example, and just substitute the word Sasquatch for gorilla, they ring remarkably familiar. We're going through that same process, I think. Dr. John Bindernagel has written a great book called The Discovery of Sasquatch. And his thesis is that Sasquatch has been discovered, it just has not been recognized. And he shows how science is going through the same process that it struggled with to acknowledge the existence of the gorilla, for example. But
why is there such a reluctance to look at these things? I mean, all of breakthroughs happen when you look outside the box, when you're willing to accept the fact that what we know may not be reality. Why would anybody at this point, when we're realizing that places like Papua New Guinea is this enriched land of flora, fauna, and creatures that we thought extinct or that never existed, we're finding proof that they still exist right here on our planet. Why would we be putting the rest of this aside?
Well, science has always been very conservative, and that serves it well to a point. But when that conservatism is so dictated by prevailing paradigms, like this single-species hypothesis, that was finally overturned. But the idea of what I refer to as relic hominoids, of persistent lineages of this bushy hominoid tree, both human ancestors and our close relatives, the great apes. That idea is just starting to get some traction. I mean, recently, New Scientist magazine, which is a popular British popular science magazine, had a story, a cover story entitled "The 10 Top Questions Puzzling Researchers of Human Evolution Today," and one of those questions was, "Are other hominins alive today?" So the notion is at least getting some attention and some discussion. As I said, the discovery of Homo floresiensis has put kind of a different spin on the possibility. I mean, suddenly people are talking about. First it was just assumed that this was an evolved, adapted Homo erectus, They tried to fit it into where they would anticipate, what was out there, what was known to be out there already. But then, I was asked to review the paper, the original Nature paper that described these remains. I reviewed that paper for another journal, and I kind of went out on a limb there, and I said, these limb bones look more like Australopithecines. They look much more pongid-like, more ancient than what we'd expect for a Homo erectus. And now that's the accepted dogma now, that they are most likely relic Australopithecines or very early Homo habilis. And the boundary there, the transition from Australopithecine to Homo habilis or Homo rudolfensis, these small, very early Homo is pretty gray. But the point is to think that 10 years ago anyone would consider that there could be a relic population of late Australopithecine, early Homo, as recently as 13,000 years ago in Southeast Asia, they would have laughed you out of the room. But I was at the physical anthropology meetings, and that's exactly what the commentator was saying from the podium. And this is like 2 years after I said in my review that, hey, this skeleton, these things aren't Homo erectus; these are something else. So, you can't argue really for Homo when you've got a brain that's the size of a chimpanzee, even when you're 3 feet tall. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But anyway, we now know that Australopithecines even were capable of making simple stone tool record and cutting of flesh from bones. Now goes back past 3 million years, and so there weren't Homo around at that time, at least not that we know of. But that's the thing. So the part of the problem is, back in 1967, go back to the Patterson-Gimlin film that we started off with, when that was plopped into the laps of these unsuspecting anthropologists who had ignored, most of whom had ignored the stories about Bigfoot as just stories, or of the stories of Sasquatch in Canada. It's actually the Canadian academics who first provided a venue for examining the Patterson-Gimlin film. They didn't know what to make out of it. I find it so amusing, actually, in hindsight, that one of the prominent, actually this was one of the Smithsonian staff, I can't remember which scientist it was, but he said, look at this combination of features. From the waist up, it looks like a gorilla. From the waist down, it looks like a hairy human. It's inconceivable that such a combination, such a mosaic of features would exist in nature. This was in 1967. This was before we knew what the skeleton of an Australopithecine would look like. And what did it look like? Well, from the waist up, it looked like like a chimpanzee. From the waist down, it looked like a hairy, short-legged human. Inconceivable that such a combination exists, but guess what? It did. So Bigfoot actually anticipated in the combination of features of a large bipedal primate characteristics that were yet to be discovered 10 years down the road, literally. And there's lots of things, actually, aspects about Sasquatch that, and both anatomies and behaviors that people thought, well, that's really weird, for example, Sasquatch are always stealing salmon from the smokehouses and the drying racks of the Native Americans, But wait a minute, primates don't eat fish.
Well, and if that's a truism, and we know that that's what they do, why is there not a camera somewhere watching this?
Oh well, there are, but the use of trail cameras has been completely unsuccessful. Well, at least as far as capturing a conclusive, convincing photograph. There's some iffy ones out there, but we now have a growing. In fact, I was just collecting a few of the papers for a little editorial I was writing. There's a growing literature now. In fact, there's a whole book that's been published on the use of game cameras, and they have demonstrated that they are quite visible to most wildlife. They pick up on the sounds they make, the light they leak, not to mention the human sense and the novelty of some new object in their familiar backyard, so to speak. For all those cameras, it's not that surprising if you have a fairly intelligent, rare, elusive animal that we haven't found the moving needle in a haystack with the game cameras.
Well, with that said, though, they're seen walking across roads. That obviously they're aware that those roads are traversed by cars or vehicles, and people are around those areas. It would seem that if they're so intelligent to avoid game cams, why are they crossing the road? And if you say to get to the other side, Dr. Meldrum, we're done. Let's go ahead.
Well, yeah, I know that, and that's very true. I can't jump into the head of a Sasquatch. I guess perhaps those headlights aren't seen as much a threat as something that smells like a human that they're unfamiliar with. I don't know, but it is true. Roads and streams. If you want to see a Sasquatch, your best chances are on a road or close to a body of water, a creek or a lake shore. That's the highest percentage of encounters. So.
Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, our guest. One last break. We'll come back with the footprints being some of the best evidence of proof of these creatures out there. One of the most amazing mysteries also happens to be, where do the footprints go? How is it that they're there 1 second and gone the next? What does our guest have to say about that? Stay tuned to find out. Case for Bigfoot with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. Dr. Meldrum, footprints. We follow them, they trail along, and then suddenly and mysteriously disappear. Have they beamed up? Where are these Bigfoot going, and how do they disappear without leaving a trail waning off somewhere?
Well, I have repeatedly, not frequently, but repeatedly have had people make such claims that they start and stop, inexplicably, and yet they've never been able to document that. I've never seen anyone show me a clear case, someone, and particularly someone who has any experience tracking. Anybody who goes out and follows a trail, an obvious set of footprints, say of their pet in the backyard, more likely than not will have a point where they can't find the next track. And even professional trackers, struggle with that when tracking people or tracking wildlife, hunters, professional trackers. So, much too much mystery has been placed on that kind of sort of thing.
But there have been photographs where even in snow, they will follow a set of footprints, and then literally it's step, 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 nothing. There's no stream for them to have crossed over. There's no tree for them to have leapt upon, but they're gone. What do you make of cases like that, or do you think that those are just...
The only ones like that I've seen, or such photos as you mentioned, it's obvious that there has been, for example, just drift that obliterates the tracks at a certain point. If there really were these kinds of things, I would be puzzling over them much more than I presently am, because I just have not seen any case of such that there was one. Joel Harden was a famous Border Patrol tracker who investigated some of the track claims in the Blue Mountains outside of Walla Walla, Washington. Paul Freeman, in particular, the case where he reported an encounter and tracks were at the scene, and he made the comment that was why he thought that they were faked, is because that the footprints could be followed for a distance and then they were gone. Well, given his reputation, it should have been obvious then that if it was a matter of somebody with a pair of crudely carved wooden feet strapped to some hiking boots, that at the point that they decided to stop and had to unstrap or sit down and take off their artificial feet and walk away, that it should have been pretty obvious that was the case. And yet he didn't assert that. He didn't find any sign that there was a human involved. It's just I'm quite sure that the leaf litter or the pine needle litter or the dry ground or whatever. We had one interesting case where an individual had claimed to have been repeatedly finding footprints, and they were interesting because they were human-sized. He wasn't finding big, 13, 14, 15-inch tracks. These were 8 inches and 10 inches, respectively. There was a pair of them that he had cast repeatedly, and sometimes in very remote areas, so he claimed. And we had a case where we actually had a film crew. One of the Monster Quest episodes we were down is called Sierra Sasquatch. So they were filming this ultralight, and we had some time off, so we went, this gentleman took us, myself and my colleague John Mainzinski, took us over to show us some of these tracks that he had seen recently. Well, we ended up on a beach next to a little reservoir that was developed, had a parking lot, it had bathrooms and changing rooms, cinder block buildings, and the beach was covered with footprints. And he points out these ones, and sure enough, they were the same feet. I mean, you could recognize it was the same 8 and 10-inch individuals. Well, I simply backtracked the one, and it led right back to a boulder. And right there where those tracks stopped, the boulder was approached and straddling the actual initiation. The footprints were a couple of waffle-printed hiking boot prints.
Oh, gotcha.
Then I turned to this fellow and I said, "Don't you see are you connecting the dots here?" I said, "How can you continue to think that these are anything other than people out recreating barefoot when you've got this right in front of you?" Unfortunately, I snapped pictures of the thing myself and documented it photographically, but the cameramen, when they came later that afternoon, a big storm had built up, and the wind was so strong it actually pushed the water from the reservoir, pushed it up like high tide against the upper end of the reservoir and washed out the prints altogether.
One last question for you, Dr. Meldrum, and we've got a minute left, so I don't mean to pressure you, but Tim, go ahead.
Real quickly, Dr. Meldrum, in the interest of protecting your research, protecting your reputation, we've talked a little bit about TV shows throughout the last couple of hours. There was a show that you were on called Bigfoot Captured, and Dave came up with the topic for it. For lack of a better term, some people call it a fakeumentary, where it's, film footage and then real cuts. How do you justify doing a show like that, yet still protecting your research?
Well, you have to realize that when I'm approached by a producer, I try my darndest to get a good sense of what the motivation is, what the intent is, what the scope is, who else they're interviewing, how they're going to depict and approach the subject. In this case, this thing, I participated in this. It was over a year and a half ago that we did the filming for that. And at that time, he had mentioned that, amongst other things, no title had been decided on. Amongst other things, they said that they were thinking of doing some kind of a dramatization, and he wanted of capturing the Sasquatch to introduce the notion or the conversation around the question: what would happen? What would be the chain of events, and what would be the implications? How would science react? How would you react? And we had some conversation about that in the interview. I didn't see any of that on the show, but I had no idea that they were going to build the entire show around that. I mean, my